We are in the third week of our Easter message series, When Life Gives You Lemons. As a church, we continue to celebrate the resurrection of Christ through April and into May. Easter tends to be a cheery time of the year. But this Easter feels different. In the shadow of COVID-19, we are living in a very uncertain time. And in that way, it is very much like the experience of that very first Easter. The apostles didn't wake up on that first Easter morning filled with confidence and hope for the future. Instead, they were filled with fear and doubt. Their whole world had just been rocked by Jesus' death on the cross. Their hopes and dreams for the future were sealed with Jesus in the tomb. So they were very unsettled and worried, much like we are today. They didn't know what the future held. But that mood changed through the course of the first Easter season. As they discovered the empty tomb and interacted with the risen Jesus, their mood and their perspective on life completely changed. As they came to faith in the risen Jesus, they discovered a renewed sense of hope and confidence in the future. And so while we still find ourselves in this confusing time, we're exploring how we can squeeze the most out of this time, how God calls us to grow and experience life change, not despite our difficult circumstances, but because of them and through them, how to make lemonade from the lemons in our lives. If you've missed any of this series and would like to catch up, you can always do that by visiting our website. Go to stalphonsus.net. This week, we're looking at a tough aspect of growth. We're talking about selflessness. As soon as this COVID crisis began here, many people went into survival mode. They started stockpiling on toilet paper and on a few other things too. But it's because of a very basic human instinct. When the world around us seems to be going crazy, we kind of go into survival mode. In other words, a crisis can often make us panic. And so we're looking out for number one, for ourselves. And I get that, I do. I'm human too. But in times like this, it can obviously set us up for a disadvantage. And besides, we know that God calls us to be selfless, although that's usually a lot easier said than done. So to break this down, we're going to look at another story about an encounter between the risen Jesus and his first followers. We've been in the Gospel of St. John these last 2 weeks, but our Gospel today is taken from St. Luke. And here's what he tells us. On the first day of the week, 2 of the disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 11 kilometers from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. So it's the evening of that first Easter Sunday. 2 of Jesus' followers were leaving Jerusalem and walking to a town called Emmaus. It was a journey that would have taken them about 2 hours on foot. They were talking about Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem a week earlier, and then his sudden fall only a few days later as he was arrested, sentenced to death, and nailed to the cross. They're walking away from the other followers of Jesus because they believe that movement is dead. There's nothing left for them there. They have to look for a positive future somewhere else. They're walking west into the sunset at the end of the day, which adds a sort of somber element to the whole scene as the day just keeps getting darker and darker. Luke continues. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went to them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So Jesus himself, the very person they're talking about, starts walking with them, but they don't recognize him. This just goes to show how little progress they've made in trying to understand everything that's happened. They were talking about Jesus, but they couldn't even recognize him, even though he's standing right next to them. They were so focused on their own sadness, their own sense of despair and confusion, that the literal answer to their problems is walking right next to them. And they miss it. Now, we can shake our heads at this, but this happens to us all the time too, doesn't it? I can think of many times when I couldn't see something that was so obvious because I was just so focused on all the wrong things. Left to our own interpretation, or with others who don't really have any more insight than we have, we can get stuck in fruitless thinking. We often need some input, some outward focus that goes beyond our wisdom and our comprehension so that we can actually get somewhere. St. Luke continues, Jesus said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. You ever ask a question that just stops people right in their tracks? You ask what you believe to be an innocent question, and you can see that you have clearly struck a nerve. It throws someone off completely. And that's exactly what's happening here. The disciples literally stop walking. Their whole expression changes and reveals that they're completely sad, dejected, and hopeless. One of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" So paraphrased, it would sound like, have you been living under a rock? It would be like someone saying to you now, what's the coronavirus? Well, what else would we be talking about? Everyone, friends, everyone, the whole world is talking about this thing. Well, everyone in Jerusalem was talking about Jesus and what had happened to him. But Jesus plays dumb to give them an opportunity to express themselves. And so he asks them, what things? And they describe Jesus and the great things that he did, saying that he was mighty in deed and in word. Maybe you've never thought of Jesus in this way. Often, pictures of Jesus make him look soft and weak. He's gently cradling a lamb or softly speaking to someone. But those images don't really capture the real impact of Jesus. See, crowds of people followed him because he was mighty and powerful in word and in deed. When he spoke with power and authority. But he didn't just give good speeches. He acted powerfully. Cleopas had followed Jesus because he was mighty and powerful. And then he says perhaps the saddest line in this story. He says, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." We had hoped. In other words, they had stopped hoping. Not only had things gone badly, but the months they spent with Jesus now seemed like a waste of time. They felt maybe let down and disappointed with the outcome. It hadn't gone the way they had hoped or wanted. And now it was back to the old drawing board. And they figured that the best way to continue was to split off and to fend for themselves in a new town with a new start. I mean, let's be real. They were hoping that Israel would be redeemed. So many of the Israelites hoped that God would redeem them by sending a Messiah who would overthrow the power of the Roman Empire. And that's not a bad thing to want. But it wasn't the whole point, which is pretty similar to this whole panic buying thing. Not a bad thing to be prepared. But when the priority is being placed on material goods, it shows a misguided perspective. Oftentimes, our lens is too self-centered or too narrow, and these two disciples were no exception. And so, Jesus responds, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart not to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. Jesus corrects them. He tells them that their hopes were out of order and misguided. What you thought had dashed your hopes, the death of Jesus, was actually necessary for your hopes to be fulfilled. You thought of redemption as overthrowing the Romans, but you were hoping in something that was much smaller than God's plan. See, in order to redeem Israel, the Messiah had to suffer and die, and then enter into his glory. Now that the Messiah suffered, died, and rose again, Israel would become a light to the nations. The whole world would be blessed through Israel, through the death and resurrection of this suffering servant. He hadn't just come to restore one nation. He had come to restore all the nations. He hadn't just come to free the Israelites from their oppressors. He came to free all people from oppression to sin and death. They had it all wrong. And so Jesus takes the rest of their journey to explain to them that it wasn't that their dreams had been dashed. It was actually that they hadn't been dreaming big enough. And then Luke continues. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. So Jesus pretends that he's going on. But the two disciples asked Jesus to stay with them. We're seeing them start to open up now. Freed from their focus on themselves, the two began to actually listen to this stranger, to turn outward, and then invite him to dine with them. It's incredible to see what's happening in the midst of this crisis in our world, too. While there will always be those who go into pure survival mode and focus in on themselves during these times, we've also seen countless people blossoming outward, reaching out to people around them. It's actually quite the opportunity that we have these days to grow in selflessness, and it starts with reaching out to those closest to us. Maybe asking your elderly neighbor if you can get their groceries for them, or calling up a friend who lives alone just to check up on them, or giving your respect and patience to grocery store clerks and other essential workers who put themselves on the line for you every day. It's others-focused. It's loving our neighbor where selflessness begins. But friends, it does not end there. Think of loving others as the first tier of selflessness. We're about to see a very perfect example of how extending hospitality to a stranger, of moving out of self-focus into other-focused, actually prepares the disciples to recognize God's presence. Check this out. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. In the breaking of the bread, they finally recognize Jesus, as he says the same words that he did before at the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. They see that this stranger is in fact Jesus. The Son of God has been traveling with them all along. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scripture to us?" When Jesus had spoken to them about the scriptures and put the story of what God was doing in a larger context, their hearts were burning within them. And it impacted them so much that they ran right back to Jerusalem to tell others what they had experienced. They've gone from looking inward to looking outward. They're focused on serving others. And they've gone beyond that to the second tier, which is saying to God, not my will, but your will. Not my will, but your will. They heard Jesus, and they saw him, and they recognized him, and they responded with faith and with action, and they just had to share this truth with others. Couldn't keep it to themselves. So maybe, friends, we're looking at this crisis all wrong. We can go beyond the fear and the anxiety and the panic. We can turn ourselves and our focus onto serving others, and not just in serving ourselves. It is there that we recognize God. Maybe this crisis that you think has dashed your hope is the way in which God wants to raise up something far greater than you had ever imagined.